Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here in San Francisco this lovely sunny day with Richard Frazier. Wow, Richard, it's so good to see you.
Nice to see you. I'm so glad that you're doing this project. I think it's a wonderful thing to get some ideas from the sort of second generation of Arnold Jacobs thinking before we all sort of die away.
Yeah, Richard was the founder and tubist of the Chicago Chamber Brass for many years, and you were the professor of tuba at University of Oregon, preceding my time there. And now you're in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
What? Just going back to Chicago, Richard. When did you first encounter Mr. Jacobs? What was your period of study approximately?
Actually, when I went up one time to a tuba symposium at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. So I brought a student. I was teaching at that time at Sam Houston State University, and one of my students and I drove to Indiana, and I had set it up to right after that to drive on up to Chicago and take a lesson with Mr. Jacobs, and that was my first lesson.
What year was that?
So it must have been probably 74.
Okay.
You know, because that was when I was teaching at Sam Houston State University. That was I'd of course heard of Mr. Jacobs for a long time. I remember the Chicago Little Symphony. I can't remember the conductor's name, but anyway, I had heard about Arnold Jacobs, and so I cornered him. He played a concert in Texas, and so it's maybe Pampa, Texas, or something like that. And I cornered him, and I asked him about Mr. Jacobs. Oh, you should study. And then when I was playing in the Amarillo Symphony, there was a clarinet player named Ralph Wilder who encouraged me to study with Arnold Jacobs. He had studied at Northwestern, and he said, if I really wanted to be a great tuba player, I should hear what Mr. Jacobs had to say. And so I was very excited. I remember just coming to Chicago. It seemed like I was walking on air. That's the whole electricity in the air, because that was where the greatest orchestra in the world was, in my estimation, and where I could actually meet Mr. Jacobs.
What do you remember from that first lesson? What was that like?
Well, let's see. I always did long tones, and but there's long tones and then there's long tones. You know, I'd done a lot of study out of the embouchure builder, Lowell Little embouchure builder, and that was sort of my book that I used for a long time in that period of my life. And so I felt pretty good about long tones, and so I played, and Mr. Jacobs said, "Well, that's really not a tuba sound." And so, and he said, "I want to encourage you to study long tones," and I was very interested in hearing this. All this sort of took me by surprise, because the long tones were a very important function. But if you're not doing long tones with the aspect of flow, airflow, like he is his philosophy, and that really brings into a real core tuba sound, it's not very productive, and it obviously hadn't been productive, because he had the idea that I didn't do long tones very much, and then I knew right then that I had some work to do.
You have to come back and see him again.
Right, exactly. This reminds me of, like, Mr. Jacobs often said that he really did not recommend that people study the Rochu melodious etudes, the Bordoni studies, for anything other than musical interpretation. But do not play that type of music expecting to really get airflow and everything, because that you can play with compression and make those things sound pretty musical or pretty good. Yeah, but to really study the tuba the way he would study it, or to study brass playing the way he would study the flow rate and the air, always had to do also with the rhythm and the articulation. It was all one thing with him, and so now, after studying for years with him and being with him for years, now it's very clear to me why he heard what was in my playing that needed to be improved. And so he, of course, as he often did, hit the nail right on the head.
Right. Yeah. He did it in very quick order too.
Yeah.
Just moving ahead, maybe a year or two. What do you recall were some of the bigger items in addition to tone that he helped you with? What did he do?
Well, so at that time, as I said, I was teaching SM Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas, and a friend of mine, John McCarthy, trombone player, principal trombone in the Houston Symphony, and I would drive up to Chicago, and he would take lessons with Mr. Kleinhammer, and I would take lessons with Mr. Jacobs. So we would do this intermittently. Every few months, I would try to get up to Chicago over a long period of time. And this helped me a while because it gave me space to work on the stuff. But basically, the things that I remember that are the most important for me is to get the right airway, and to do this, of course, Mr. Jacobs uses speech, and he would say, play with a tiny tongue, and he would draw in my Arbin book. There's pictures of a tuba bell with a tiny little T on the bell and a great big O coming out. So dominance on the vowel. And he would say, he had such an elegant way of expressing himself. He would say, in addition to have a tiny tongue, he would say, you need to spring load your playing for the openness of the vowel rather than the closure of the consonant. So that he always had such a beautiful way of expressing himself, and I think this is one of his most distinguishing characteristics. It's just the very elegance of him as a man and a musician that I believe no one has come close to. I mean, there's a certain it was an old style, an old school of elegance. He had an elegance of expression. He loved words. You could tell just by the way he presented himself and the way he described things. Where he would say things like the entrance of the tone into the atmosphere. In terms of timing, which I thought was just like pure poetry, the way he would say it, and of course in the mellifluous tones that he had in his deep bass voice, it was really made an impression. And also just by describing things, entrance of the tone in the atmosphere, getting your thoughts out of your mouth and into the actuality of the tone coming into the atmosphere, the tone out.
Great.
And he would say things like, well, if you try to control your tongue, the tongue will become an unruly beast.
Mm-hmm.
He loved that phrase, unruly beast, and I always thought it was just so. It really made me happy every time he would say that. Even if I was the one that my tongue was getting in the way.
Right,
I just love the way he described it, and he would say he had such a way of talking. He would get people to establish the dominance of your thoughts in the art form of music. He would say that over, in the art form of music, always expressing yourself through the art form of music, and he truly lived that way.
That's great.
So he had, in addition to elegance of expression, he had an elegance of thought. Just the way that he had all of this stuff in his head in such an extremely elegant way. Like, he had a way of describing things and coming up with definitions that were, I thought, was like a lawyer, like a definition that that people couldn't get confused with. It was just it would present a minimum of options for confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Like lawyers, when they're coming up with a document, they will come up with a terminology that there can be no confusion as to what this is. And so this cuts down on the misinterpretation of his ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the elegance of just using the scientific principles, in playing. I was always influenced by that. And then besides all of that, in the lessons, just this elegance of character and the way he carried himself, and he had excellent manners.
Mm-hmm.
He was generous.
Very generous.
Incredibly generous. I don't know how many meals he bought for me. It's just like, it's really totally generous. He lent me his adjustable cup mouthpiece that Shilke made for him, and he said, I want you to have this on a long-term loan. This is a long-term loan. So one of the last times I saw him, I said, well, this is long-term enough for me. I'm going to bring it back to him. And so I brought it back to him, and he was just like a child. He was just so filled with joy at just holding this mouthpiece that he hadn't seen for years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, because a lot of those mouthpieces had just disappeared.
Right.
And he was just, he was very, very wonderful in that way. That was a wonderful moment. That I have so many moments with Mr. Jacobs that are so etched in my mind I'll never forget. And he had such respect for everyone, for all of his students. He had respect for his students as people. And he was interested in his students as people. He loved teaching young people. I'll never forget. He told me one time, he said, well, I just enjoy being with young people. When I get around people my own age, all they want to talk about is their bowel movements. But he was interesting. He wasn't ready to be an old person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
He just wasn't. Like the last lesson that I had with him, he said, I want you to come and see me again, and don't wait too long because I'm not going to be here that much longer. And I know we had talked a lot about death, and he was perfectly fine with it. He described death and the transition, turning over things. He said, well, it's just like clearing and adding machine. You know, getting the old thoughts, the old ways out, and bringing on new ways. And life just has to be like that, like it has to be like clearing and adding machine.
You know, Richard, you had Mr. Jacobs out to the University of Oregon for several multi-day series of master classes, and in that, as a part of that class, you had shirts printed up, and when I arrived on campus in 2001, I was given one of those shirts, and it said, you know, Wind and Song, which is what it was referred to as when I first started studying with him in '81. But it seemed like it shifted, that the order of those two words, or those, well, three words, two words and an ampersand, shifted over time. Did you notice any shifting in his pedagogy and the way he approached things during your 20-some years of lessons?
Oh, well, I know that the first time he saw those shirts, he was like, well, that's not right. It should be song and wind, 90% song and 10% wind, and you know, so he definitely wanted the dominance to be on the song. I really didn't notice a lot of the basic thing. His basic way of teaching was pretty much set from the very first, as far as my time with him. Now, of course, there are many people that go much further back with him than myself, and they might notice something different. I mean, Abe Torchinsky, I guess, was his first student when he was like 16 or something.
Right.
And
yeah, okay.
I think he was an extremely developed soul. I believe he had many incarnations of development, where when he came into this world, he just knew a lot of stuff already, and it was just there. He's talked about, like things that happened to him in his playing. Like he would mention that when he was first a bugler, and then he was playing the trumpet, and he was doing all this stuff, and then after he took a few lessons, he couldn't play. And so, he had gone through stages of development, but they were at such a young. He was at such a young age when he was in his formative part of his development. I mean, he was at, how old was he when he went to Curtis? I mean, he was 14 or 15, and so he had his act together by the time that he was in Curtis.
Yeah.
And but he remembered everything from the very first.
What do you remember about the whole Tabuteau influence, the subphrase, the microphrasing, and
this is very interesting. He always talked about that a lot. It's about his classes with Marcel Tabuteau, and he had tremendous respect for the great oboist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, Tabuteau, and they studied phrasing at Curtis at that time, and I think that's when he really got the idea that you had to have your concept of the music in your head, and that controlled your thinking. He would always say, don't try to control your body, control the music. And that is what I think he got from Tabuteau, was this phrasing, the way he talked about phrasing, which he often mentioned subphrasing. Said, like in the Arbin, it might bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum bum ba bum bum. Well, subphrase, he would say make little sub phrases, or ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum, and he would draw lines. He would just think of this part, and don't try to get the long phrase. Just try to do these little sub phrases and get quality of all the different little sub phrases. And I've thought about that for years, of course, and it all just makes so much sense because you can't think of a whole line of music anyway. So I tell my students, don't try to play the whole line perfectly or the whole piece perfectly or even the whole phrase perfectly. Just try to play the next note perfectly. And that was his whole idea, is the constantly regenerating the phrase, having a regeneration of the phrase with little sub-phrases that constantly kept your thinking fresh. And that I believe he got from Tabuteau. I know Tabuteau influenced him with that a lot, with that idea of sub-phrasing. And it makes so much sense to think of music like that. And I think that's why when people maybe sometimes it seems a little daunting to them to develop the musicians, that they think, oh my goodness, I have to learn all of this, or no, you don't have to learn that. You just have to learn the next note that you're about to play. Constantly having a fresh mental concept of just the next note. And I believe you can hear that in his playing.
I think so too.
You can hear that energy. It's always fresh because he's constantly rejuvenating his phrase in little tiny parts.
Yeah.
I think there were so many things I believe that Mr. Jacobs brought to people's attention that were so incredibly innovative. Before Arnold Jacobs, there was great teaching going on, but all of these teachers based what they said and what they wrote on their own experience about their own biofeedback. And I think that's why there is so much confusion of what you see written. Like you'll read things that great players said that conflicted totally with each other, and you know they were great players, you know they were doing it right, but their impressions were not. Sometimes they weren't on the same page. And I believe that with Arnold Jacobs, he did not base what he had to say on biofeedback. He realized he would say over and over, don't trust your biofeedback. Don't trust what it feels like. Your body will lie to you. Did he tell you that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Your body will lie to you. It will feel like you're blowing wind, and you're not. And so you cannot trust your own biofeedback. And I think that's why that there was so much confusing stuff before Mr. Jacobs, and he based what he had to say to students not on his own biofeedback, but on scientific stuff of what really must be happening. I'll never forget. We were working on the Ride of the Valkyries, and so I was not particularly satisfied with my own playing, but he whipped out his incentive spirometer, and he had this at that time, a little plastic sort of a mouthpiece. It wasn't a real tuba mouthpiece. It was just sort of a plastic thing. I think he lost it later on. But and he turned the incentive spirometer upside down, and he stuck this on the end of the hose, and he said, "Okay, now play the Ride of the Valkyries." And so I would play the Ride of the Valkyries, boom, 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 and on the when I was playing the short notes, the 16th notes, I would see the ball, they would drop. And that was like getting run over by a bus. Because obviously I was not blowing wind on that 16th note. Cold, hard facts showed me the ball dropped when I played the 16th note. So I thought that I was blowing wind on that 16th, but really I wasn't. I was irrefutable proof. So then I had to work on really blowing the wind, blowing the rhythm of that excerpt, and making sure that there wasn't just a compression, which felt to me like I was blowing.
Yeah.
But I obviously wasn't. And so I think he was the first one to really do this. And getting back to Tabuteau, Mr. Jacobs would talk about his classes of phrasing and solfege. He said, one time he said to me, he said, I think if I had a music school, I would teach two things, acting and solfege.
Wow. Yeah.
Two things, acting and solfege. And so I got to thinking about that. Well, that's exactly what it needs to be. You need to have a separation, developing the musical aspect away from the instrument, musical concept, sort of away from the instruments, so they can always be not influenced by your particular problems at that moment that you're having with the instruments. If you don't, then you're always limiting your musical capabilities according to the box of your current playing. You know, you would never be able to step outside that box and improve. So Mr. Jacobs would always go for getting the music right, and then that was reflected in the playing. He would often say, "You got to have two tubas, one in your head and one in your hands, and the one in your hands is merely the one that's a reflection of what's in your head." And so I think that all came out of his study at Curtis with Tabuteau, where the idea was to go through all of those solfege books, the French conservatory system of solfege, and get the music established already. So you already have an idea of on time, in tune, with a good sound, good sense of style, all of that in your mind, and then you go to your instrument, and then you're not limited by your own limitations at that particular moment. And so I believe that he got that from Tabuteau. And that again was he managed to step outside the box with that kind of teaching, because all other kinds of teaching, you're always, the student is limited by their current capabilities. Well, we want our students to grow beyond that.
Right.
And but first they have to grow with their musical their sense of music.
What else you have? What else you have to share, Richard?
Well, golly, to put my experience with Mr. Jacobs into one morning or even one day would be just a mammoth thing. It would be like James Joyce writing Ulysses, you know, one day's experience. I mean, it turned out to be a giant book. Well, my life with Mr. Jacobs is still a giant book, you know, because I'm constantly influenced by these things. I think that the way that he influenced brass pedagogy most significantly was just by breaking things down to their lowest common denominator, the bit you can remember. Like, I don't know, I tell my students, like, it's like like mother's rule, take small bites and chew your food well. So he would break it down, and I think the thing that is the core of his teaching is the connection between the air and the lips. The air and the thought, the song, have to be connected at the lips. And that's why he says song and wind. And you break those things down. If you have both the song from the seventh cranial nerve, coming down and right at the lips, and the air right at the lips, with not being blocked by the tongue being the only thing that moves in your mouth, and unless you have serious dental problems, that connection of the air and the lips is the one thing that I think he really cleared up for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because if you have a moment where the note did not come out, there are two reasons why that happened. Either there was no song at the lips, or there was no wind at the lips.
Right.
So that's the way that just breaks it down to its simplest parts, and I think that is something that is most easily understood. Also, the idea that of the tongue, and the whole idea of tonguing and everything, and Mr. Jacobs would say, as I said before, he would often say the tongue will become an unruly beast, and the only way to control it is through speech. Through speech, you already know how to talk. Your tongue will behave beautifully if you just employ the ideas of speech communicated to the tongue, rather than ideas of we are following the rules for correct tuba playing. Your tongue does not understand that,
right.
But your tongue already understands speech, and so he would get the control of that tiny T and the big O, the dominance on the vowel sound, which vowel sound equals wind, and the diction of the T, getting the tongue out of the way so is not blockage. And I think that is the only problem that really bogs people down, is blockage from the tongue.
Right.
And then controlling it. I mean, over and over, Mr. Jacobs would say, play with a tiny tongue. Get the tongue away from the lips. And he was right. But it took me a long time to really figure out exactly what he was talking about, because I had another issue in my playing, in that I wasn't firm enough here.
Okay.
And he would say firm surfaces vibrate better than mushy surfaces. Any stretched rubber band vibrates better than an unstretched rubber band. And so I really did not understand that for a long time. And if he would say, you really need to knead the rim. He did not want people to go, vibrating particularly without
Free buzz, you mean?
without the rim being there. And in my case, maybe it was he just defined it in my case because he knew that I needed to have firmer surfaces and I needed to knead the rim more when I played. And so if you don't have that setup that he was talking about of kneading the rim, then the deal with the tongue is hard to grasp. But it's hard to really get exactly what he's talking about, because you have to stumble on it. But and for a long time, I had trouble because I didn't play with firm enough surfaces and so or firm enough contact with an equal distribution of pressure all the way around the mouthpiece. And so I didn't really understand that. And so after I got that, then it became more obvious. This other stuff came to me. I know one thing that he would say. He would say, "Well, your tongue is blocking. Here, I'll show you." And so he would put his hand here, and my tongue would get, or there would be this bump, the bulge that would come down. He said, "Well, if there's a bulge there, there's just as big a bulge above that's blocking the air." And he said, "Here, feel me." And so he would have me put his hand under his throat there, right on his throat, and he had very soft skin, so it felt really squishy. And he would play, and it was never a bulge, never had that bulge. And so, you can't go about it. Well, I'm going to develop my playing to where there's no bulge there. The goal is to develop great sound and great musicianship, not to develop, trying to follow some rule of bulges. And so I really didn't understand this till I got firm around the mouthpiece.
Okay.
So it all has to be in place, and then everything just falls into place. And so I think that is really cool. And he would, of course, his studies, like early on that he did with the brass section, and noting that when all of the different instruments played a middle C, they had exactly the same flow rate. All these great players had the same flow rate and the same pressure.
The enharmonic pitch at the same dynamic level.
Right. And so it exactly matched. So the big lesson from that for players of the larger brass instruments is that there are no high notes for the tuba. It's just low notes on the trumpet.
Right.
That's all you're doing is low notes on the trumpet. And so when you go for high notes on the tuba, you shouldn't emulate Maynard Ferguson going for a screech note or Cat Anderson, because you don't play those notes.
Right.
And so I think that was incredibly significant. And then his concentration on the song, the think system.
Yeah.
He would often say, "Oh, it's just got to be just like the Music Man. Just got Harold Hill knew what he was talking about, and the think system, and just establishing control of the music always leads to establishing control of yourself physically on the instrument. And that's something that I've applied to a lot of different instruments that I happen to play. And so he would say one thing that I think was really great. Well, many things were great, but the one thing that was just so magnificent. He would say, when you are using the think system, when you're controlling the music, you're thinking the sound of the note. You are in competition with the very greatest artist in the world, because that's the way they play. That's the way all the great artists of the world, they're not thinking about anything else. The sound of the next note is so big in their mind, if they are really in the art form of music, like he often said. That is the way they are thinking. They're so full, their minds are so full of the sound of the next note that they probably can't even think of anything to say. Any words, language is totally out of the picture because of the dominance of the thought of the next note. And so he would say, then you're in competition with the very greatest. And I think that's a wonderful thing to tell a young person. It's that the competition isn't on who's the best player. It's how you think. Are you in line with the way that the greatest players of our time are thinking? Then you're in competition with the greatest.
Well, that's really great information.
And he was the greatest.
He really was spectacular. Richard, thank you so much for having us come into your home. And off camera, Puddles and I had offered Richard a genuine University of Oregon souvenir, but he's asked us to give that away to a student. So we're going to find a student to give that to in your honor. It'll be some malted duck balls or University of Oregon duck nuts or maybe a cup. We'll find something. But thanks so much, Richard. It's really great to see you.
Thank you, Michael.
And,
it's great to see you again.
I really appreciate the taking time out of this busy day.
Oh, it's been a joyful thing to me to honor the man that has meant so much.
Yeah, for sure.
To so many people.
Yeah, indeed. And now back to you.